Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the 12 Questions series brought to you by the Modern Japan History Association. If you're interested in learning more about the Modern Japan History Association, you can visit our website at mjha.org. My name is Nick Kapoor. I am an associate professor of Japanese history at Rutgers University, and it's my honor to be the moderator for this event. And I will very briefly introduce our main presenter today and our interlocutor before letting them take it away. Our presenter today is Jonas Rüegg, who is a senior researcher at the University of Zurich, and his dissertation, which was entitled the Kuroshio Frontier, Business, State, and Environment in the Making of Japan's Pacific, won the inaugural dissertation prize from our association, the Modern Japan History Association, and is forthcoming as a book from Cambridge University Press in the near future, so we can all look forward to that. And then our interlocutor today is Paul Kreitman, who is Associate Professor of Japanese History at Columbia University. And Paul, of course, is the author of Japan's Ocean Borderlands, Nature and Sovereignty, which came out just last year. And so the two of these scholars that we have with us today, I would say, are the two, most prominent, perhaps, in what we might call the Pacific turn in Japanese history. And I can't think of two better people to have this discussion about that direction in our field, and also perhaps the broader oceanic turn in the field of history itself. And so we're very much looking forward to what Jonas has to say about this, and Paul will be asking the questions. So without further ado, Jonas and Paul, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you, Paul, for offering me this stage. And anyway, thank you so much for this honor of winning the inaugural dissertation prize of the Modern Japan History Association. It's really thrilling to be here and to speak to an interested audience, and that with Paul. Obviously, I loved your book, Paul, so I'm excited to hear your questions. And do you want to jump right into it?
I'm going to jump in because the honor is totally mine to be able to bask in your reflected glory as a winner of this prize. Completely richly deserved. It's an amazing piece of work. So I'm going to call it a book because even though it's a dissertation, it reads like a book. It's incredibly polished. It's going to be out very soon, I imagine, with not much revision. And clearly, I can see why it makes sense for me to be the commentator, because it does read in some ways like a prequel to my book, or maybe my book is a sequel to yours. They really do. They overlap a tiny bit, yours kind of really segment into mine very elegantly. So it's really fantastic that we have your work out here to highlight mine, I suppose, or vice versa maybe. So I'm just going to get into it really and key up the questions. I believe I have 12 questions, which I'm going to interpret liberally. There may be sub questions within those 12. I'm going to start with the hardest, maybe, which is to ask you simply, what is this dissertation, this book, all about? Can you give the kind of elevator pitch that you would give at conferences and so on, and give us a sense of the temporal and spatial scope, please?
Yes, very gladly. So in a nutshell, my book, I'm also taking the liberty to call it book. My book argues that the ocean has a history, which is maybe a bit less surprising today than it used to be 5 or 10 years ago. But it is true that the ocean has a history that matters for early modern and modern Japan, for our understanding of economic development, of course, but also for the development of ideologies that drove Japan's imperial expansion in the modern period. I make this argument by using the frontier concept. The ocean was a frontier. It was a resource frontier, for one thing, an abundant ocean fed by maritime currents, the Kuroshio current, this western boundary current of the Pacific that, like the Gulf Stream in the Atlantic, allocates nutrients and then warmth towards the Japanese archipelago. We have the Oyashio current, the cold current that comes down from the Arctic and conflues with the Kuroshio east of Japan, where in the 19th century you have a mingling of international whaling crews British people, American people, some French that mingled out there with Japanese fishermen and formed some sort of like informal diplomacy, of course. And those are all chapters that I think only, or episodes of history that only really come into the picture once we start to study the ocean in its own right. I make arguments that are directed both towards the field of Japanese history, which is also my main field of training, and also to sort of a global community of environmental history or Anthropocene studies even. And towards Japan, I guess, I make an argument about the boundaries of Japan, spatial boundaries. That's why frontiers, borderlands, the ocean itself, but also temporal boundaries. When does modern Japan begin? Where do we need to start stories about modern Japan's ideologies, its empire, its scientific development, its geopolitics, right? So a temporal argument. And eventually also an argument about certain myths that are really at the foundation of how Japan is commonly depicted in popular discourse as well. Is Japan an island? Is it resource poor? How significant was the national seclusion in the early modern period for the formation of Japan, right? And then contrasting that in the global dimension, I think it's also a general argument about the role of oceans in history. Oceans in the history of the Anthropocene, oceans in the history of industrialization, global industrialization, but then also an argument about places that matter. Why do we care about small islands? Why do we care about people living on small islands, right? And in that sense, I think I'm trying to sort of bring these different sides together to matter at the imperial and maybe even at the global scale of history. Oh, and you were asking about temporalization. The chronology of the whole study is essentially a 19th century history. But again, here, I think the 19th century is not really an analytical category. I like to start in maybe the late 18th century with the geopolitical impact that came out of the Sea of Okhotsk with Russian expansion towards East Asia, right? And then leading up into obviously the empire. That is also, by the way, one of the things that I'm working on to revise as I make this a book, where to end this story, because the frontier is open-ended. And I also think that the frontier is still there, and it is developing in different modes now. We're not going that much, or the Japanese are still somewhat going for whales, but not as much anymore. What matters now is deep sea mining, rare earth, access to rare earth deposits. And in that sense, I think it's an ongoing story. So maybe we'll be talking about the challenges of sort of where to cut this off as a narrative. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That's a great summary. I think you sell yourself short. I mean, you're right that the heart of the book is maybe late 18th to 19th, but you start off in the early 17th century, right? Talking about like, and so that there's that. And even if you think of the kind of the earth science part of the book, which is talking about macronutrients and the flow of the currents and the monsoon patterns. I mean, that's kind of deep historical longue durée stuff. So I think it's a much bigger sweep than you're taking credit for. But thank you. That was a great overview. And you kind of touched on a few different things that I'm going to return to over the course of our session. But I thought before we get into the kind of the nuts and bolts, I'd sort of ask you how you came to this study. So, I mean, often with my students, I sort of prompt them towards reading a book by Rea Mullaney about where research begins, to kind of think about like the emotional driver, like the actual trigger that drives their interest on a kind of deeper level. So for you, what was the initial prompt for you to get into this project? What was the motivating force or the spark?
Yeah, I've also just got my hands on Mullaney's book a few days ago, actually, because I was aware of it, but then since you brought it up, and I agree with Mullaney that research is deeply personal and that it should start with a personal sort of point of access towards an abstract field. And for me, I think finding original points of entry into a past time, like different society that works according to different logics, is usually begins by looking for cold spots, to look where nobody's looking actually. And when I was just embarking on this graduate school journey, actually a little bit before, I pulled up a map of Japan. I was already living in Japan as an exchange student, and I tried to identify the hardest to access place in this country, and it looked like that would be the Bonin Islands. Arguably, that's maybe some mountaintop would be harder if you had to climb up there. But the Bonin Islands are actually quite hard to get to, also known by the name Ogasawara in Japanese. There is one ferry per week that goes there, and you're on board for 24 hours, and then you have to stay there for a week before you can go back. And so I went to just see what that place is like. And I also went to the town office and asked whether they had any, as it's quite normal in Japan, local town archive. And it turned out that there was actually a lot of stuff that not many people had looked at, because even as I found out later, my professors at the Shiryu Hinsanjo, the Historiographical Institute at the University of Tokyo, where I was later working on my dissertation, even they didn't really appreciate how much stuff there is in Ogasawara, because it's so far away and nobody went to take a look. And so in a way, that was for me, this discovery was the entry point. And then as I started looking at the documents, of course, you have these fascinating biographies coming up. I'm thinking of a guy named John Bravo, who was born in the Cape. I don't remember whether it's also part of your book, Paul. David Chapman has also encountered him in his book. A guy who was born in the Cape Verdean Islands, was a whaler, somehow marooned in the Bonin Islands because he fell sick, and then he died, the subject of the Japanese Empire. And so all these stories open different ways of looking at what is Japan, what is subject to it of the Japanese Empire, and what are, unexplored pathways into what we're looking at today when we see Japan.
Thank you. Those are two really good points. I'd say that I feel a definite resonance there, in that there is something alluring about these islands, right? Particularly Ogasawara. Like I didn't visit them until much later in my research than you, and for a long time I kind of fought that impulse. I didn't trust myself to be so enchanted by them because of all the discourse that is generated around the islands. But I think you have to admit it, don't you, at some point, that they do have an attraction just by being so remote and so exotic, I'm going to say. Oh, thank you. Annika's put some images available. Oh, cool. I think this is from the Oliver Austin archive, maybe. So that's fantastic resource. Thank you, Annika. That's in the meeting chat. Okay, I should pretty crack on. Okay, so question number 3. What research technique did you learn while conducting archival research that you'd recommend to other researchers at any stage in their career? It could be an early PhD students, or it could be mid-career or late career researchers. Obviously, the techniques are developing so quickly with digitization and other methods. Have you anything that you'd recommend to people that you worked out kind of in the course of doing this project?
Well, I guess like most people in grad school, I also spent quite some nerve-wracking time trying to learn to code and all this kind of stuff. It's handy, of course, especially like artificial intelligence for text recognition and such things. For Japanese, I haven't actually really found anything very useful yet, but maybe it's out there. But I should say that I'm generally somewhat skeptical of these sort of technological or technifying approaches towards our field, because I think research in the humanities is more comparable to art than to science in many regards, and it's personal, as we've mentioned. It is a process that depends on meandering, on experimentation, on open-ended, also high-risk sort of projects that are likely gonna die out before they see publication, right? But these projects are important because you get back to them later and it improves the quality of your research. And in that sense, I think also just like, spending time trying to decipher old scripts is actually an important experience. And after all, I think, our profession is a profession of philosophical engagement, of asking questions that are not asked based on, horizons of experience that are not ours. And in that sense, so going into the archive and just getting lost in this different society and then emerging from this archive with a different point of view on present issues, I think is part of what we are supposed to do. And of course, it's easier to sell, say, a database where you can just look up anything past and you find easy answers to easy questions, right? But there are plenty of companies who do that, right? And so I think for us in the academe, it's probably good to stick with, working with languages, the meaning of words. Just like spontaneously, one example that I have on the top of my mind, I was on this panel last week on the meaning of sustainability, and with people in tech policy and so on, and everybody was very excited about the fact that sustainability has become so popularized because now the companies can all, think about how to be more sustainable as they try to sell more and more. And nobody really asked the question, what does this word actually mean, right? And then if you can sort of look at a different discourse that in this case happens in the Japanese language, where these words have a different history, different philosophical connotation, different historical burdens maybe that come with it. You start to look at what's common in your own language with a different eye. And I think that's also one of the really contributions of Japanese studies that is oftentimes underestimated or undervalued.
That's several very deep points.
Just like summing up your question about skills, I think probably skills that are important are language, not just for communication, but also for sort of like engaging with just like the critical exercise of asking what do the words even mean, and immersion and sort of like I guess openness towards risk and doing things that might or might not be a success in research.
Thank you. I find that a very deep and in some way quite encouraging answer, right? A kind of a defiant stand our ground against the tech bros and their moonshine. But your point about kind of the shifting and kind of linguistically contingent meanings of these terms reminds me of so when I was a grad student, Frederick Marco taught a whole seminar on the meaning of nature in Japan, which gave me a nosebleed, the amount of kind of critical theory we had to read, but it was incredibly enlightening and made me think about the kind of, if almost like nature is such a complicated word, and sustainability is a related word that has kind of untold depth, even in English, let alone in other languages. So thank you. Okay, cracking on. Number 4. Can you please share with us one archival gem? We've all had that moment when we uncover a document or a source that either kind of confirms what we suspected, but hadn't been able to prove until now, but is kind of, or opens up a whole new vista in our project. So can you share one with us, please?
Yes. Well, let me share this as an anecdote, which is maybe a bit of a sort of like a growth story, intellectual growth story. So when I started out on this whole graduate school's journey, of course, like many people, I knew about this narrative that Japan was secluded and that then a fleet of black ships came in the mid-19th century, and that was an earth-shattering moment where Japan was first exposed to, American power and Western technology, ideologies, and so on. And as I started to take an interest in Japan's maritime history, which seemed to be a bit of a bridge between, secluded Japan and the outside world, I started questioning that. And I got in touch during that process with the Japan Association for Naval History, Kaijishi Kenkyu-kai, which is a very sort of active, substantial community of mostly, researchers who are like growing older. I was, I think, the youngest participant at every conference that I went of theirs. There I met with Tanaka Hiroyuki, who maybe, Paul, you've come across his text as well. He is the authority on Ogasawara local history. And of course, I loved to learn from him a lot. But it was all about Ogasawara, these islands, and what happened in these islands. But we sat down and talked about, the greater implications of Ogasawara history. And at some point, he got so excited that he went to the, not basement, I guess. Anyway, he disappeared for a moment, came back with an old, yellowed, worm-eaten piece of paper, opened it up on the table, and there was the map of Shimaya Ichizaemon, dating back to 1675. I'm just going to share my screen. You should be able to see my map now. This map was actually created during a Pacific exploration mission at the order of the Tokugawa shogunate in the 1670s, 1675. That is several decades into the period of so-called national seclusion, when a few castaways who were driven to these islands, managed to survive and return to Japan, reported about the existence of the islands. And within a few years, the shogunate had put together a large Chinese junk crew that then set sail and immediately found those islands, which is also remarkable, by the way. 200 years later, it was that straightforward anymore to locate an island in the Pacific. And you can see this map here as it indexes really the islands. With in yellow, you can see potentially arable flatlands along the shores with indications of how many cho, I guess, like, of space that would be, what the territory is like, how distant the islands are, and most importantly here, bottom left, islands within Japan, which serve as sort of a pathway. You can see Hachijojima, and then this would be Aogashima somewhere, and then a few rocks that are now known as Torishima, until you would find the Bonin Islands. Now, the shogunate considered thoroughly whether or not it would be worth to colonize these islands. The conclusion was no, and nothing happened, which is in a way the end of the story, but it's not the end of sort of the critical questions that it raises, right? And in a way, I think, yeah, just the fact that this happened is a blow to all sort of seclusionist narratives, and they in a way shaped the way I was thinking about this Kuroshio Frontier, this Japanese interest in the Pacific as a geopolitical space, as an economic space, as a space of migration, that there is a much longer history than just reaching back to the Meiji before. So I'm going to stop the share here, but if anybody wants to take a closer look, I'm happy to share the map. It's actually, yeah, with me now, because Tanaka Sensei was handed it with me saying I'm old and it will be in better hands with you. And that was just really also a very touching moment for me to see this appreciation of a foreign scholar who comes and sort of picks on what he has been doing for many decades. So that's my story.
I mean, it's an incredible story and it's a credible source. And I think in a way it sort of underlines your earlier point in that if that's the opposite of kind of scraping text databases, to kind of do the shoe leather and go to those conferences and meet people and network and draw on this kind of rich living archive. Can we even call it? And that's clearly what you've done. That takes time. You have to do that in country. You can't do that via the NDL website or via Google Books, whatever. So exactly. I think that's a great example of that hasn't changed, right? Yeah.
In my opinion, that's the most beautiful part of our research, going and reaching out to the community, in this case, the community of naval history in Japan, right? And meet people who share an interest and to whom these things also have a personal meaning, you know? And maybe we'll get back to this topic when we talk about my project in Micronesia. Giving back to the community and is part of the research because it is rewarding, not just personally, but also research-wise.
Did you say giving back to Micronesia? Was that?
Well, I was going to talk maybe later on if we have time about my new project in Micronesia, but I don't want to.
Okay, we'll get to that. Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. So I think that's a really good segue, though, sharing that map about a couple of questions I wanted to ask. The first, I guess, is about seclusion, and I'm going to try and paraphrase your argument, but I think one of the arguments you're making in the book is that the Kuroshio Frontier just shows how interconnected Japan was by ocean currents, by weather patterns, by trade winds, and by all these kind of oceanic interactions, with the wider world. And there's kind of one more debunking of the seclusion or sakoku kind of thesis. I mean, I'm going to push back a little bit, if only because apart from this one moment, it's just me saying how great it is. I love this project. And this is my pushback, which is that I think it's possible to kind of read your book as almost, in a way, accentuating the efforts that the shogunate must have had to take to stop the interactions, given that it was so enmeshed ecologically, almost like Earth systems with the rest of the region. In a way, that almost makes it even more surprising they were taking such efforts to try and stop interactions. So I just wondered if you'd agree with that reading as well, maybe.
Yes, well, I mean, I know that this comes out, you pointed out a place in my dissertation where I was quite vocal about, sort of saving the sakoku paradigm into the 21st century. And that was partly the grad student in me writing, and I'll probably tone it down a bit in the book. But it is true. I think that the Sakoku paradigm is at the heart of most Japanese essentialism. And I would try to take it down whenever I can, because it is so limited to formal diplomacy. And just like looking at periphery, looking at the lived experience, you find a lot of course, people couldn't travel freely, that's true. But you wouldn't, that doesn't mean that you can look at Japan historically in isolation, right? And the way I try to sort of like make an anti-Sakoku argument is obviously by looking at a transnational space of interaction, a transnational space of ecological or resource competition. And you've already heard maybe from the way I'm speaking that I'm a bit caught up in a struggle against windmills with the Japanese nation state, not because it's Japan, I love Japan, but just because the nation state is so powerful in shaping history. You experience that day by day. The archives are organized according to state institutions. What makes it into the archive or not is a decision of state officials. And in a way, I think as historians, we have the duty to question that. And I'm trying to do that by speaking of the Kuroshio Frontier again as a transnational thing. Maybe you have an opinion on how successful I was about that, because it's true, my book is and will be a book about Japan and about how Japan changed its strategies, its geopolitical position within a multinational state. But I think it's important to always remember that history was not programmed, that it could have come out differently. And like one point to point you to is like the Ryukyus could be an independent agent in this book, because it was, or also Taiwan, because the whole sort of absorption of these places at some point in the Japanese Empire is ahistorical if you look at it in the 19th century. And at the same time, Japan was close to breaking apart at least twice in the decade after the, or from the Bushin War to the Satsuma Rebellion. And these episodes perhaps are good moments for us to remember as we go questioning whether Japan is really such a supreme unit of analysis historically.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with all of that pretty much. I mean, maybe I'm harping a bit, but I absolutely agree that the seclusion policies, if they existed, only ever existed to a kind of level of state policy. I still think that's not nothing. And just because nationalists like the paradigm doesn't mean they're wrong about it, even if they're kind of right for the wrong reasons. And I'm quite struck by, again, going back to that map, the fact that in the 1670s, the shogunate is sending galleons, way out into the Pacific. And that's lost, right? Because of this ban on boat building. In fact, I think one thing I want to mention as well is this surprising to me always that Hachijojima is still supplied throughout this period, even though you have this ban on ocean-going boats. Still, they are sending boats out, quite far into the Pacific, which I'm not sure if that proves this was my main point. But it's interesting that these policies, I think they do have an effect. I think we can't discount them completely. In a way, your book, I don't read it as necessarily disproving that the Sakoku policy had an effect. It sort of shows that they had to kind of struggle against, really, if that makes sense. The kind of innate interconnectivity of the ecology and of the ocean space. Anyway, I think we should move on. But yeah, okay. So this question: what did you have to cut out of the project for whatever reason that you'd hope to return to yourself, maybe one day, or that you wish someone else to return to at some point?
Partly that connects to what I've just been saying about the power of the nation state, right? I was like beginning of my PhD, I was going to write really a history of the Kuroshio that is a deflection of the North Equatorial circulation that goes to the Philippines first and then crosses, to Taiwan, and Bashi Strait, and then up into the Ryukyus. A part of it goes into the Tsushima Strait, Sea of Japan. The other part goes south of Honshu and so on. And just a space in its own right, sort of a shared ecosystem, a catchment area. And so I visited places in the Ryukyus, Yaeyama Islands, Yonaguni, in Taiwan, Lanyu, Liudao. Those are all islands that have well, a deeper or more modern history of interaction with the current for different reasons. The island of Lüdao in Taiwan was settled by Han Chinese, or I think Hakka, partly Hakka people, labeled as pirates around 1800, driven there by the sort of expansion of state control of the Qing dynasty or the Taiwan Strait. And so there's a different sort of frontier process going on there. But it was just, in a way, overloaded for one book, because the temporality of empire is different in Qing China than in Tokugawa Japan. Ryukyu again has this ambiguous state, but it also is, the history comes to us in a different archive, different language, different sort of concepts that are at work. And I just couldn't fit it all into, but definitely I would love to see whether that is me writing or somebody else, a history of those places, ecological history of those Kuroshio Islands. And yeah, maybe I'll have a chance to get back to that some point later on in my career.
Thank you. Again, there's an uncanny resonance, because also in my book, the last chapter deals about the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. And the focus of that chapter is about Japanese conservation efforts. And so it kind of makes sense intellectually, I think, for it to be focused on the Japanese side. But there were these Taiwanese fishermen who were, visiting the islands all the way through from the pre-war to the 1960s and so on. And I never got around to actually kind of looking into that side of the story, even though they could be alive. They could be, these guys were like young men in the 60s, right? So there's probably old guys playing mahjong in some, cafe in Kaohsiung somewhere. But the people go out and actually find these guys and talk about and find out their experience of visiting the islands. I never got around to that, but if someone's out there who wants to go and track these guys down, that'd be an amazing compliment to my book. Maybe even subvert some of the findings. But that's a kind of a loose end that I don't think I'll get around to, but I hope someone does someday. But it totally underlines your point about archives and also career incentives. They kind of shape these projects in ways that are hard to subvert, unfortunately. Maybe someone else will find a way. Okay. Sorry? Did you want to add something?
Fascinating to go and find people and again, engage with the community directly.
Exactly, yeah. Okay. So next question, I think we're on maybe 9 now, 8 or 9. I don't know. What excites you about the Oceanic turn? And how would you characterize the work done so far? And what would you like to see more of?
Yes, well, the Oceanic turn, I mean, at this point, it's actually a substantial turn. And I kind of regret a bit not like having delayed my book publication, because just the last year with your book, Paul, saw really, I think so far it's been some sort of a peak of the wave, but maybe it goes on. We've had very important publications in the past 10, 15 years. What excites me most about Oceanic Japan, conceptually speaking, for our field, is that it opens new pathways for Japanese history, and especially also Japanese history of before the 20th century, into questions of global environmental history. And again, I mean, most in this audience will know that the Japanese nation state today controls a maritime space that's 12 times its land surface. So that suggests that Japan maybe will have something to say in the whole sort of historicization of the world oceans. But oceanic history is also an inherently multidisciplinary field. It's distinct from maritime history or naval history, of course, because it's more environmental, but also it's more multidisciplinary in terms of, it involves, maritime migration. It involves, I guess, history of science. How do we understand the seas? All of these things. And in that sense, I think it speaks to questions of the Anthropocene. And so Julia Thomas is also a historian from our field. Of course, she's written this book, The Anthropocene, in which she characterizes the Anthropocene as not a problem that can be solved, but as a predicament in which we can prevail with more or less dignity. I think she wrote something like that. Just to say that sort of like multidisciplinary exchange is becoming increasingly important, because it needs to be sort of like facing the ecological problems of our age requires being inclusive. And in that sense, I think oceanic history is a way to sort of generate this conversation with other fields of the humanities, but also the sciences, of course.
Thank you. I agree with all of that. I don't think it's peaked yet. I don't want you to panic.
No,
any
no,
questions
I
on,
didn't want to have said, but just like to give you credit, Paul. I think you really contributed to a sort of a high tide at the moment.
You're too kind. I think it started a long time before me, but I mean, I was doing a kind of a brief book tour, or the past year or so, and there's so many grad students out there working on oceanic history of one kind or another. Like, I think some are on this call, in fact, but it's I don't think it's anywhere near peaking at this rate. It's still gathering momentum for sure. I've realized that I missed quite an important question I'm out of order, but I wanted to go back to the kind of the Tokugawa Meiji transition, and I think again you sort of were getting into this with showing that wonderful map, in that you do see these impulses towards colonialism, settler colonization, even in the late 17th century, right? So I suppose, how would you say that your work helps us to rethink that Tokugawa Meiji transition and think about the way the Tokugawa state, maybe the late Tokugawa state in particular, how that functioned during this period of kind of global integration, if you will?
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, I don't mean to sort of diminish or sort of like play down the importance of the Meiji reform. The Meiji reform is clearly a moment of global historical significance. The whole social reforms, economic reforms, but also ecologically a lot starts to change, of course. What I think emphasize in my work are the continuities in ecological terms, thinking again of the ocean as a frontier that sort of grows gradually. And I think you pointed out that also in terms of geopolitics, there could be some important continuities that come out of the book that I wouldn't have probably put in the foreground myself, but it's true that you say the Japanese empire actually tracked back its ideologies to philosophers such as Sato Nobuhiro or also Hayashi Shihei, who are relatively prominent, have become quite prominent in my work, not really aware of their appropriation by the empire in the 20th century. Hayashi Shihei was this geostrategist who in the 1780s and 90s, I think he died in 93 or something, sort of pointed out that Japan is in the middle of, or let's say he drew up something that I like to label a Japanocentric world order in clear competition or clear distancing to a Sinocentric world order. So he drew up a map of Japan on which China is just some sort of side note, but what is prominent is a frontier in the north, Ezo, a frontier in the south, Ryukyu, and a frontier in the southeast, the Bonin Islands. And that probably inspired Sato Nobuhiro about 30 years later, 1820s, to write up this major strategy called sort of a secret plan for unification, in which he argued that Japan should first invade the islands of the South Sea, colonize them, and build up sort of like the forces it will take to invade the continent. And that is obviously utopic. Thank God it didn't happen in that form. Well, maybe later it did, much later. In the 20th century, in fact, the Japanese then sort of like navy, with the competition over Nanshinron, southern expansion, and sort of like the continental expansion that was more backed by the army. In this sort of ideological context, Sato Nobuhiro became some form of a forefather of the southern expansion strategy.
So I guess this raises all kinds of fascinating questions for me. So, thinking in the 20th century, there's a huge amount of literature of people kind of tracing the genealogy of geopolitics as a specific, form of thinking and writing and so on. It sounds like you're almost making the case there's a kind of endogenous Japanese geopolitical way of thinking and writing that emerged independently somewhat of that kind of Western tradition. So if that's the case, when did that emerge? Is this that comes out of is he inventing it, Hayashi, and they're the ones coming out with it, or is it kind of an older thing there? Is it already there in the 17th century? Like, how old is geopolitics or that way of thinking in Japan?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I'm not sure how confident I am about answering it, but I can give it a try. So I think geopolitics as a field is really the study of how the geographical features of the Earth sort of affect the way humans make strategies, right? And in that sense, I think probably, I mean, Hideyoshi probably had a plan to, I don't know how I would locate the beginning of modern geopolitics, but again, if I think of like the Japanese empire and when did people start thinking in an imperial manner or an expansionist manner, then I think Hayashi Shihoe is somewhat of a beginning point. If we go further back in the past, I mean, another scholar I have studied is Nishikawa Joken, a geographer who in the early 18th century, about half a century before Shihei, argued that Japan is not conquerable because the sea is impenetrable and it will be impossible for any invader to sort of set enough forces across the sea to invade Japan effectively. And that is probably a different era of thinking about Japan's geopolitical situation. It's a hard question. I don't know how I would define the geopolitics, honestly.
I mean, you gave a great answer. Yeah, obviously, it's a massive question, but thank you. I think there's a huge amount more to be written about that.
I mean, in the West, the beginning of geopolitics, modern geopolitics is often associated with Alfred Mahan, who is a naval strategist as well.
And you talk about proto-Mahanian thinking, right? I think, which
yes, but that was more with regards to Perry, who has been characterized by more like expert people as a proto-Mahanian strategist. But when did the Japanese start to think about, say, the Bonin Islands, not just as another open, sort of like non-treaty open harbor, but more as an sort of like a base for further expansion? That is a question that I can't, certainly after the Meiji period, but whether the Tokugawa shogunate had a bigger plan of expansion towards the Pacific. Certain people in Japan certainly did, but whether the shogunate embraced that is hard to tell for me right
now. Yeah, I feel we could do a whole panel just on this question, but I'm going to press on and try and get back on track. Okay, I think this is question number 9, I believe. Your work brings Japanese history into contact with indigenous or Pacific history. For example, John Bravo, the figure you mentioned, and the various other Hawaiians or Polynesians who end up on the Bonins, brought there or traveling there on their own efforts sometimes. So what new insights does that reveal for both fields, for both Japanese history and for Pacific history?
Yes, I mean, I think it's extremely promising. But we're still at the beginning of this sort of interaction, at least interaction at eyes height between the fields of Japanese and Pacific history. For me, I guess I grew interested in the Pacific also, again, through the Bonin Islands and seeing all the people that gathered in these places, and then obviously digging on, seeing how, you know, Japan really has an underrepresented but nevertheless important colonial heritage in the Pacific, in the former Pacific Islands mandate of the South, so-called South Sea Nanyo mandate, right? And I am now exploring this more in the Nanyo. I had the chance to travel to Micronesia last December in the interest of a new project, which I hope to realize, maybe scale up into second book project eventually, to study how these histories interact at an epistemic level. And obviously it gets deeply post-colonial here because most archives of Micronesian history are first in somewhere Madrid, maybe Berlin or Hamburg, and then eventually in Tokyo, you know, because it was a country that has layers upon layers of colonial experiences. And these archives are all in kept in foreign languages, right? And so I think there is something that you can bring back as a historian again to the community by sort of like opening these archives. But there is also a problem about those archives representing a colonial gaze, of course. And so it necessarily is eventually a two-way conversation, right? So what can the field of Japanese history learn from Pacific history? And I think it goes back to quite fundamental questions of epistemology. Just because we're looking to often oral traditions, a different encoding of historical collective memory, but also different encodings in different understandings of like what constitutes time? How do we perceive space? What's the meaning of kinship? And speaking about kinship, for example, the sort of the core modality of historical knowledge in the Pacific traditionally is genealogy, right? And so how can we tell, for example, the history of the Japanese Empire or the legacies of the empire in a genealogical manner? And how can we sort of also extract new ways of really actually engaging with history in a literary sense as historians? So that's quite open-ended right now because I'm at the beginning of this project, but I hope that it will continue this way, and if so, then maybe in a few years I can like present you with a bit more substantial treatise.
I'm going to resist the urge to ask more, but that sounds like a fascinating and again possibly sprawling project, right? If you're going to be looking at multiple archives, it's another kind of longue durée kind of sweeping project, or more kind of 20th century, or
yes,
anyway.
I think it will take me in a different time period, with the 20th century, maybe even up to the present. And I think that is one of the conceptual sort of interventions that become necessary when talking about Pacific history, because in Pacific sort of traditional modalities of memory, there is no binary of past and present, but the past is inherent in the present, right? And so maybe the way of accessing the past of a place like Micronesia is not to go and look for the record of what happened on like July the 7th, 1900, but it will be more about talking about what are sort of like the conflicting narratives of the past, and how do these conflicts generate new political alliances or political sort of like interaction between different groups, and that's very interesting. One more side note that I would like to make on this is that I've already indicated it means shifting gears as historians. I am exploring now the meaning of art as a means of historical inquiry, and I've actually received quite some positive feedback from my university here. Got a grant for this to use art and collaboration with artists as a tool of teaching history. And the idea for that came out of the engagement with Pacific history, because again, the modalities of historical memory in the Pacific are more artistic than we are maybe used to it. We look at tattoos, we look at songs, we look at also art in the sense of a sort of community interaction, right? Historical knowledge is being passed on from generation to generation in a somewhat ritualized manner in specific places with specific objects present. And in that sense, engaging, since most of this history is esoteric and won't be readily shared with an outsider like myself, I think there's maybe more potential in studying those modalities and to engage with sort of like the practice rather than the content of the knowledge, right? And that's where art comes in. But I'll stop meandering here. Maybe you can get.
No, it's fascinating meandering.
Q&A.
So the next one is about frontier versus borderland. Obviously, frontier is front center of your book, and it runs through it. And I've used borderland in my title. Now, in my dissertation, I was quite strident about this. I had a whole kind of anti-frontier, and I think I've definitely mellowed over the years, in part through talking to you at conferences and so on over the years. But nevertheless, frontier versus borderland. For you, how do you understand the difference, and why, if at all, is it a useful distinction?
Yeah, I think this is probably the big conceptual question. How do we frame Japan's relationship with the Pacific? And I know that there is some quite deep-rooted resentment against the frontier concept for, well, historical reasons, mostly among American colleagues. Nevertheless, I think it is, for my money, the best framework to understand the multifaceted nature of this relationship. And I know, again, that your book, for example, you have an entire paragraph about why frontier is not appropriate in your analysis. And actually, you made it clear to me that in your case, borderland is appropriate because your book is also mostly about these actors, Japan and the United States, and sort of figuring out their relative power over the Pacific in a way. And so, but what I found surprising is that you reject the frontier, among other things, based on its sort of assumption that the state, whatever the metropolitan frontier is a timeless actor. And I think for me, it's exactly the opposite. If it's a borderland, that naturalizes the nation state or the empire, whoever builds this border. Whereas a frontier is more, well, multidimensional. There are different agents involved. It's a space where state power fades and blurs into each other with other, I mean, my dissertation is mostly British and American presence, but potentially there are other actors involved, right? Pirate islands that pop up because in the absence of state control. So I think the frontier accommodates a much greater diversity of agents. And at the same time, I may have mentioned this before, I think it is also a way of sort of like pooling together individual experiences that you wouldn't find in Google Maps because the islands are so small, right? But once you name it the Kuroshio Frontier and you work out the shared experience of these many islands, in this case, in relation to the metropole, basically the places where the social and environmental cost for the growth of the metropole accrues, then you make them matter, give them the momentum to matter at imperial stage, imperial scale.
Yeah.
So, and I don't know whether the borderland could do that as well, but I think for me, with the frontier, it's more obvious.
Yeah, so you really made me think about this when I was preparing for this session, and I think in my book I did maybe reluctantly allow for the commodity frontier. I think it's a term that Sven Beckert uses as being a useful analytic, and maybe that's what's underpinning a lot of your story too, right? This is about zones of extraction of resources being appropriated and so on, and maybe if we talk about kind of an economic trend or something or process, then maybe frontier captures that better than borderland. But for me, I suppose because political economy and ecology was kind of at the core of my analysis, for me, borderland did that work. But yeah, I definitely have come around to accepting frontier has a utility.
The frontier is also a bit of an argument about the, I think, fluidity of, well, identities, but also fluidity of the space and like the sort of uncommitted nature that actors tend to have in the frontier. Out of opportunistic reasons, also like you change national affiliation as it's opportune. All of these things are also things to consider, even though they're not in the foreground of either mine or your book, I think.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
I would say borderland and frontier maybe both do that. I'm not sure it has. I think both can maybe achieve that purpose. But okay, so last question. You've already answered the last question about like what's next. So the second to last question is, what insights do you think can be applied to historians working on non-oceanic history, for example?
Yeah, I guess that's something that is more being changed by this greater trend of Anthropocene studies and awareness of like the globality of contemporary issues than by oceanic history per se. But I think oceanic history of Japan in this case has raised the awareness that sort of like the oceanic footprint is visible everywhere. The history of a farming village in the Japanese Alps is in some regard, oceanic because the fertilizers are most likely herring or whalebone or so, that these networks of trade sort of bring the ocean ashore. That is definitely one thing. I have found the concept of terraqueous history quite useful to frame that. Terraqueous means obviously terra and aqua together, sort of like the idea that human life is not either landed or waterborne, but that it's sort of like a codependence. And the implication for the Japanese Empire again is that on the one side you have like soybean farming, soybean frontier, as Sakura Christmas is written in Manchuria, but on the other side you have the pelagic empire, as Bill Tsutsui calls it, and they both sort of like coexist and also sort of condition each other. So terraqueous I mean, maybe we'll come up with a better framing, but for now, I think that's the best sort of term to sort of describe it. It's a word that was used in the early modern period to describe geography at a time when the world was perceived, in Europe at least, well, in Japan as well, as more of an archipelago rather than a dualism of continents and oceans. And in that sense, maybe that is something that might be coming back in the 21st century or in the Anthropocene, that we think of global geography more as a sort of like ocean geography, and the lands of humans are lined up around it rather than the other way around.
Yeah, thank you. That's really good. It's only a small thing to add, but it occurred to me that your book is as much about the atmosphere as about the ocean, right? About kind of the relationship between the land, the sea, and the air, and the kind of the weather
Yes.
and climate patterns, which of course extends beyond the sea. I mean, you have over land as well.
Yeah, one chapter certainly is about the atmospheres as well, geophysical processes in general. It's the chapter I happen to have just like rewritten over the weekend, so it's quite present here. There I also make the argument that, so I do this with the Kuroshio current. It's a geophysical process, right? A maritime current that is just like atmospheric phenomena. It's tied to the rotation of the Earth, and teleconnected to El Nino, to different developments that are quite far away and were certainly not part of the vocabulary of early modern Japan. At the same time, I think they could make for new comparative frameworks, or maybe we won't be talking about comparative history, but more teleconnected history. One thing that I have recently been thinking about is how so sort of renaming Tsuyu, the plum rain in Japan, renaming it monsoon as climate scientists do. What sort of implications does that have about the way we think about the connections between East Asia and the Indian Ocean world, right? Or even East Africa, for that matter. Eric Tagliacozzo's recent book has spoken to this a bit, but not so much with relation to geophysical, I guess, scales of teleconnections. But I think it could be a way to overcome this worn out, East-Western comparison of like, well, history of capitalism, here's the Mediterranean, and then here's the East Asian Mediterranean, the other place in the world that invented capitalism, right? So that we sort of like diversified along those lines of geophysical teleconnections.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I was hoping to get into the whole monsoon zone concept, which I think is a really fresh way of framing Japan spatially as well as temporally. And yeah, it makes these great connections with Southeast Asia, South Asia, the exciting work being done by Sunil Amrit and people like him. So yeah, I think that's a really fresh intervention as well that I think will have a huge impact on our field, hopefully in the years to come.